On the evening of the 27th of April, 1993, a military transport plane lifted off from Libreville in Gabon, carrying the entire national football team of Zambia. It stayed in the air for less than 2 minutes. It came down into the Atlantic Ocean 500 meters from the beach, close enough that people on the shore heard it. All 30 people on board died. 18 players, the head coach, the assistant coach, 3 pilots, a flight engineer, and the officials traveling with them. Not one survivor. And here is the part that almost nobody says out loud, because it is harder to sit with than the crash itself. The fire that started this did not bring the plane down. One engine caught fire, and a de Havilland Buffalo can fly on one engine. It is built to. The crew followed the procedure. They reached for the switch to shut down the burning engine. They shut down the other one, the working one, the one still holding 30 people in the air. And the moment that switch moved, that aircraft stopped being an aircraft. That is the fact this whole story turns on, and we are going to take it apart properly. Because the pilot who moved that switch had a reason, and the reason was not incompetence. It was a light on an instrument panel that was lying to him, and a body that had not been allowed to rest. So here is where this goes. We start with a team that had just beaten Italy 4-0 at the Olympic Games. We go through the engine, the warning light, the checks that were run on that plane 6 days before it flew, and the report that a grieving country waited 10 years to read. Then, we go to a beach in Libreville 19 years later, on the night Zambia won something no Zambian team had ever won, a few hundred meters inland from the water that took the first team. And we finish in October of last year, with a number that tells you the debt has still not been paid. Because the wreck is not the ending here. The wreck is roughly the middle. Those 18 men are buried together in a semicircle of graves in Lusaka, just outside the Independence Stadium. Zambians call that ground Heroes' Acre. Remember the name. Almost everything in this story is either walking away from that semicircle or walking back towards it. Start with who was on the plane, because if you do not understand what Zambia had in 1993, none of the rest of it lands. Seoul, 1988. Olympic Games, group stage, Zambia against Italy. Italy had Ferrara Carnevale, a squad built out of Serie A when Serie A was the best league on earth. Zambia had a striker named Kalusha Bwalya, who scored 3 times before the hour. Final score, 4-0. It is still one of the most lopsided results the Olympic football tournament has ever produced. And it was not a fluke. Bwalya was named African Footballer of the Year that same season. 2 years later, at the 1990 Africa Cup of Nations, Zambia finished 3rd. By '93, the squad was in its prime. The qualifying campaign for the '94 World Cup was live, and the Cup of Nations in Tunisia was less than a year out. They were not underdogs anymore. They were expected to arrive. The man in charge of them was Godfrey Chitalu. In Zambia, they called him Ucar. Hold on to that name too. The fixture was in Dakar, Senegal, a World Cup qualifier. And this is where the story stops being about football and starts being about money. Zambia in 1993 was a country whose entire economy was copper, at a moment when copper was worth almost nothing. There was no charter budget for a national team. There was no commercial flight that made the route work. So the Football Association of Zambia did what it had done before. It asked the Zambian Air Force, and the Air Force put the team on a de Havilland Canada DHC-5 Buffalo. A Buffalo is a good aircraft. It is a rugged, short-runway military workhorse. It is also not a long-haul plane. To get from Lusaka to Dakar, it needed to stop 3 times to refuel. Brazzaville in Congo, Libreville in Gabon, then Abidjan in Ivory Coast, and only then the run to Senegal. 4 legs, 3 landings, 3 takeoffs. That is 3 times more chances for something to go wrong than a normal team ever takes. And the particular aircraft they were given had a recent history worth knowing. It entered service in 1975. It had been sitting out of service for 5 months, from late 1992 until the 21st of April, 1993, 6 days before the flight. Test flights were run on the 22nd and again on the 26th. Then, before departure for Senegal, checks were carried out. Those checks found carbon particles in the oil filters, disconnected cables, traces of overheating. Read that again. Somebody looked at that aircraft, wrote down that there were carbon particles in the oil filters and cables that were not connected, and the flight went ahead as scheduled. But the aircraft was not the only thing that had been pushed too hard. The pilot in command was Colonel Fenton Moane, and Colonel Moane had flown this same squad the previous day, back from a match in Mauritius. He had barely been on the ground. The first leg went fine. They landed at Brazzaville, took on fuel, and engine problems were noted there. Noted. Not fixed, not grounded. The plane took off again, crossed into Gabon, and put down at Libreville for the second refueling stop. Therefore, when that aircraft rolled down the runway at Libreville for the third takeoff of the night, it was carrying a fault that two separate sets of eyes had already written down on paper. It got into the air. It began its climb out over the water. And then the left engine caught fire. An engine fire on a twin-engine aircraft is an emergency. It is not, by itself, a death sentence. The Buffalo is certified to fly on one engine. The procedure is drilled and simple. Identify the failed engine, shut it down, feather the propeller, get back on the ground. Moane had 3 pilots on that flight deck. They identified the engine. They shut it down. They had identified the wrong one. The fire was in the left engine. The switch they moved was the right engine, the one still running, still the only reason 30 people were above sea level. The moment it went quiet, the aircraft had nothing. Not one engine. 0. On the climb out, low and slow and heavy with fuel, there is no glide and there is no second attempt. It fell into the Atlantic 500 meters offshore. Now, why did 4 experienced military aviators shut down a working engine? The official Gabonese investigation gives 2 reasons, and neither of them is stupidity. The first is a faulty warning light. The instrument that was supposed to tell the crew which engine had failed was giving them the wrong answer. They read the panel, and the panel lied. The second is fatigue, the kind that comes from flying a squad home from Mauritius one day and launching them across a continent the next. So here is the question Zambians have argued about for 33 years, and I do not think it has a clean answer. Some say this is pilot error, full stop. 4 men on a flight deck, a memorized procedure, and they got it backwards. Others say pilot error is the last link in a chain, and the chain starts much earlier, with a government that could not put its own team on a commercial flight, an aircraft that came out of 5 months of storage 6 days before, an inspection that logged carbon in the oil filters and cleared it anyway, and a crew nobody let sleep. A mistake in a cockpit or a decision made in an office long before anyone reached the runway. That is a debate worth having, and it is why this still makes people in Lusaka angry. The recovery took days. Of the 30 people on board, 24 bodies were brought out of the water. Only 13 could be identified. The government declared a week of national mourning. The players were buried together in that semicircle at Heroes Acre, outside the Independence Stadium. And then a handful of names started circulating around Lusaka, the ones who were not on it. 3 players were at European clubs and made their own way to Senegal. The captain, Kalusha Bawalya, at PSV Eindhoven. Charles Musonda at Anderlecht, injured. Johnson Bawalya at FC Bull in Switzerland. 2 more, Andrew Tembo and Martin Mumba, were at the aircraft and told at the last minute not to board. And Bennett Mulwanda Simfukwe was pulled off the passenger list by his employer days before over a paperwork dispute. 6 men. 6 ordinary, boring, administrative reasons. That is the entire margin. Then the families asked the obvious question: Why were they on a military aircraft? And who signed it off? And the answer was silence. The Gabonese preliminary report, the one that named the faulty warning light and the fatigue, was not released until November 2003. 10 years and 7 months. Compensation came in May 2002. $4 million split between the families, 9 years after the crash. The internal Zambian report on how that aircraft was allowed to leave Lusaka has still never been produced. And what I am about to tell you is worth the like and the subscribe on its own, because almost nobody outside Zambia knows it. Godfrey Chitalu, Ucar, the head coach sitting on that plane, is credited in Zambia with 107 goals in the calendar year 1972. 49 in the league, 58 in cups and internationals. In 2012, when Lionel Messi scored 91 in a year, and the world called it the greatest scoring season in history, the Football Association of Zambia took the Chitalu paperwork to FIFA and asked them to look at it. FIFA declined. Its position is that it only ratifies records from competitions it runs, so a figure built out of Zambian league and cup football cannot be authenticated. The International Federation of Football History and Statistics disagrees. Its all-time list for a single calendar year puts Godfrey Chitalu first at 109. So the man in the coach's seat on that aircraft may have had the greatest goal-scoring year anyone has ever had. And the sport has never officially admitted it. That is where Zambia was in the summer of 1993. 18 players in the ground, a coach the world would not count, no report, no money, and a World Cup qualifying campaign that, as far as FIFA was concerned, was still running. They had to keep playing. Kalusha Bwalia came home and took the armband of a team that did not exist. They found players, second division, third division, reserve teams, anyone with a passport and a pair of boots. Bwalia carried the attack himself, and that improvised, half-invented Zambia side went back into the World Cup qualifying group they had been flying to when the plane went down, and very nearly qualified. They missed the 1994 World Cup by 1 point, behind Morocco. Months later came the Africa Cup of Nations in Tunisia, and this is where it stops being a sad story and starts being an absurd one. Zambia, a squad assembled out of nothing, 10 months after burying its entire first team, reached the final. They played Nigeria, the strongest side on the continent. Zambia scored first. They went in at halftime leading a Cup of Nations final. Nigeria equalized, then won it 2-1. They lost. They came home to crowds in the street anyway, because everyone in that country understood exactly what they had just watched. But a runner-up medal is not a trophy, and Zambia had never won one. Not in '94, not in the 20 years after, through generation after generation who grew up with those 18 graves outside the Independence Stadium as the first football story they were ever told. Then, 2012, the Africa Cup of Nations, co-hosted by Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. Zambia, ranked outside the top 70 in the world, went on a run nobody had forecast and reached the final. The final was in Libreville, the same city, a few hundred meters inland from the stretch of water where the plane came down 19 years earlier. The squad went to the shoreline before the match. They played Côte d'Ivoire, a side with Didier Drogba, Yaya Touré, Kolo Touré, Gervinho, one of the most expensive collections of footballers ever assembled by an African nation. 90 minutes, nothing. Extra time, nothing. 0-0, and it went to penalties. Drogba's team missed. Zambia did not. 8-7. Zambia won the Africa Cup of Nations for the first time in its history, on the ground where it lost everything, and dedicated it to the men in the semicircle. There is no scriptwriter alive who would try that ending, because nobody would believe it. So that is the redemption, and it is real, and it is earned. But it is not the whole account, and the last part is the reason we are telling this now. Zambia has still never played at a World Cup. Never. Not once. The flight that killed that team was on its way to a World Cup qualifier. The replacement team missed the '94 tournament by a single point, and every campaign since has ended somewhere short. Then came the qualifying cycle for 2026, the widest door African football has ever been offered. The tournament expanded to 48 teams. Africa's guaranteed places went from 5 to 9, with another route through an intercontinental playoff. Roughly 1 in 5 African nations was going to get in. Zambia were drawn in Group E with Morocco, Niger, Tanzania, and Congo. The group finished on the 14th of October 2025. Morocco went through with 24 points from 8 games. Niger took 15. Tanzania took 10. Zambia finished 4th with 9. 32 years after the crash, with the field nearly doubled and Africa's allocation nearly doubled with it, the country that lost 18 footballers on the way to a World Cup qualifier watched another one go past. The graves at Heroes Acre sit in a semicircle, each one marked with a tree, on a patch of ground just outside the Independence Stadium in Lusaka. When Zambia plays at home, the crowd walks past them on the way in. They have been walking past them for 33 years.